From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome now to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I want to start with a check on the markets because they're not liking what they're seeing right now. Joining us is Abigail Doodle. So particularly the S&P, Abigail, is really not happy today.
Yeah, we have a pretty risk-off day relative to stocks and the markets overall. At this point, the S&P 500 down about 2%, headed to its worst day in about a month. And David, I think largely this does have to do with the resurgence, the reemergence of the virus. Of course, over the weekend, two back-to-back record days of the virus here in the U.S. The virus getting worse in Europe, getting very close to some full restrictions, lockdowns in both Spain and Italy. So it feels like, we were talking about this earlier, it feels like traders were hoping for the best, but not quite preparing for the worst, now getting caught off sides. We see that the VIX, that quote-unquote fear index, is also higher. Oil, another risk asset, selling off, and bonds, haven bonds, are trading higher. Another play on the day, though, David, could be the reemerging trade war between the U.S. and China, because, of course, China's saying that they're going to slap sanctions on some of the defense contractors. So on this, we have some of the greens and other commodities lower, along with the SOX. The SOX, that chip index, of course, is a poster boy of sorts for the U.S.-China trade war, and that's underperforming, down even more than the other averages, down about 2.5%. So that's another nuance developing, as if we needed more, David.
Yeah, Abigail, talk to us about the Treasury bills. I'm sorry, the bonds for a second here, because last week we were talking about the reflation trade. We saw the yield on the 10-year go up above 85 basis points. Now I see it's down below 80, actually. What happened to that trade?
So that's certainly the bid for bonds, and that tells you that some traders are a little bit nervous here, that they are hedging around not just today, but last week, because while we had bonds sell off last week on that reflation trade, yields go higher, the yield curve steepened, we actually had stocks down. The NASDAQ 100 last week down for the first time in 5 weeks. So today's trading action is really a continuation of what we did have last week. And it's interesting, another piece of that you and I were talking about last Friday was that 210s, the yield curve steepening, that does pressure stocks. So today the yield curve is in, but last week the yield curve was at the highest level since February of 2018. So that could also be a piece of what we're seeing today. So many different factors weighing on the market, but net, stock investors, traders, not liking it, selling stocks on the day, David.
Yeah, a fair amount of action, which we will keep our eye on and bring to you as it develops. Thanks so much to Abigail Doolittle for that report on the market. Well, the two sides in the stimulus negotiation reportedly made little progress over the weekend. That leaves hopes for getting something done before the election really pretty almost gone. We welcome now Terry Haines, founder of Pangaea Policy. Terry, always a pleasure to have you with us. First of all, can we basically drive a stake through the heart of stimulus before the election at this point? Is it over?
I certainly hope so, David. It's interesting. It's a classic example of people talking themselves into things. I'm frequently non-consensus, as you know, but I wasn't non-consensus on this in a Washington political context. My view of this law for a long time now has been that both Pelosi and the White House thought it was in their political interest to keep tickling markets to avoid a market's downturn or a sell-off and take credit for whatever the resulting good is. But, that's clearly not going to happen before the election. Yes.
Okay, so that's before the election. What about after the election, the so-called lame duck session? Because we've heard Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, other people say, well, we can come back in the lame duck. Is that realistic? Are the problems going to go away or be better after the election?
I only remember three things that I was taught in law school. One of them is to say it depends as much as possible. But in this case, it depends. What it depends upon is what the election results are. But my view is that investors shouldn't be fooled by talk that the stimulus deal can get quickly sorted out immediately after the election. I think it's misplaced. I'll tell you why. If there's a status quo election, in other words, if you get Trump, still a Republican Senate, still a Democratic House, you've got the best opportunity to get something done quickly. But either in an all D or an all R scenario, and the all D is likelier as a second, certainly as a looming possibility. The opposition party, in this case, the one that's going to become the opposition party, the Republicans, are going to make the new majority wait until January the 20th. There's no political reason to do it otherwise. Pelosi wants a big number. Democrats want a big number. Republicans have no political interest in giving them a big number, so they won't do it. The only way and same with Republicans, if should we get an all-R Washington like in 2016, the only way that changes is if there's an actual economic crisis of something like a March 2020 proportion, and nobody thinks that's likely. So I would say not.
So, Terry, even beyond the stimulus, let's talk about what happens after January 20, whichever way it goes, 4 more years of President Trump or a new President Biden. Is there as big a policy difference between the two of them as there appears to be? And more important, can Vice President Biden get that done if he becomes president?
Well, let me say two things about that. One is reflected in your first question about stimulus and markets. One of the more concerning things to me about what's happening with markets today is that there's an echo chamber on Washington issues that are far disconnected from what people in Washington actually think and believe what's going on. Stimulus is a very strong evidence of that disconnect. As we just talked about, most in Washington thought it wasn't likely for the last 2 months, but yet the markets continue to say that's the case. Today, we're now getting a situation where a lot of people on Wall Street are expressing increasing confidence in a unified Democratic government outcome that may lead to a significant fiscal expansion. I think that's somewhat misplaced. If you get a Biden administration, what's going to happen immediately is you're going to get internecine warfare between centrists and progressives who will think they elected Biden and will think they deserve a great deal. That sort of stuff's already happening. On a policy matter, what you're going to get is you're going to get tooth and nail fighting on what a tax increase and what tax legislation looks like. Centrists will want it to look in a much more conventional way, but progressives will see it as the basis of a Green New Deal expansion. So you're not going to get something quick or easy, and you're going to get a wholesale fight among the Democrats alone about what's likely to happen. Trump in a second term, I think, is largely stymied by circumstances. Increased debt, increased deficit. I think he does make another run at infrastructure, though. But I think those who are interested in the blue sweep, I think, have a lesson coming to them about the ways in which the president and Congress work together. We saw that with Carter when Democrats in the majority clearly didn't agree with Carter's own priorities. We saw it with Clinton in the first couple of years, and we saw it again with Obama, and we're likely to see that again. And that's not good news for those who want a quick and easy change in priorities in Washington.
Terry, you've watched this happen in Washington for so many years. One of the most important things for a new president or a president's second term is to set priorities. What's the number one priority? Because you can't get everything done. We have Vice President Biden now, former Vice President Biden, laying out a raft of policy initiatives. He can't do all that at the same time. Do we have a sense, if he in fact were elected president, what his number one thing would be? You mentioned tax reform, tax increase. That's a means to an end. That's only because he wants to accomplish something. What does he most wants to accomplish?
Well, I think what he most wants to accomplish is infrastructure. Frankly, it's not by accident that the slogan of the campaign is "Build Back Better." But at the same time, I mean, what kind of infrastructure is it going to be? What are the priorities? That is exactly where the party split here between progressives and centrists will manifest itself. When people, the centrists who vote for Biden, hear infrastructure, by and large, what they hear is they're going to fix roads, they're going to fix bridges, they're going to fix kind of the conventional systems. When progressives hear that, what they hear is we're going to put money into solar. We're going to put money into Green New Deal programs. We're going to accelerate, get rid of subsidies for oil and accelerate cleaner technologies. And push people in a different direction. And so I think even infrastructure will be a very hard sell, but they will try to use a lot of this, just as Republicans did, in so-called tax reconciliation, just like Republicans did in 2017. So that's going to be the centerpiece of whatever happens in 2021.
Terry, as I say, it's always a pleasure to have you with us. That's Terry Haines. He's the founder of Pangaea Policy. Coming up, our Swing State Series makes its last stop before the election, this time in Wisconsin, with the chair of the Democratic Party of Wisconsin. He is Ben Wikler. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows is defending comments he made to CNN Sunday that the Trump administration is, quote, not going to control the pandemic, end quote. Asked why, Meadows said it's, again quoting, because it is a contagious virus just like the flu. Speaking to reporters today, Meadows tried to clarify his remarks.
We're going to defeat the virus. We're not going to control it. We will try to contain it as best we can. If you look at full context of what I was talking about is we need to make sure that we have therapeutics and vaccines. We need to make sure that when people get sick that they have the kind of therapies that the President of the United States has.
And Mr. Meadows says President Trump won't give up until all Americans are safe and the virus is defeated. Amy Coney Barrett could be a Supreme Court justice before the end of the day. The White House says a swearing-in ceremony is planned for tonight if she is confirmed by the full Senate. That would put Barrett on the court a week before the presidential election and create a 6-3 conservative majority. She is expected to easily win confirmation. Russian President Vladimir Putin is trying to preserve the collapsing framework of a nuclear arms control agreement. President Putin has offered new missile verification measures to NATO countries. This comes after the United States withdrew from a Cold War-era treaty. Each side rejects the other's allegations of breaching the agreement. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. We've been taking a look at the key swing states in the build-up to the election, and this week we conclude with Wisconsin, a state that President Trump won in 2016, making him the first Republican presidential candidate to take the state since 1984. To give us an overview of the politics of Wisconsin this time, we welcome now the chair of the state Democratic Party. He is Ben Wikler. So, Mr. Wikler, thank you so much for joining us. Give us your sense of where Wisconsin is right now with respect to this election 8 days from now.
Wisconsin in 2020 is so conscious that it might be the tipping point state in the entire presidential race that just about everyone is talking about politics all the time. The polls show very clearly that Biden has an edge in the Badger State. He is up in the public polling averages by between 6 and 7 points. The challenge is that is also how much Hillary Clinton was up in 2016 on Election Day. So at a surface level, you might think it's the same. The reality is it is totally different. In 2016, people on both sides, but especially the Democratic side, didn't know that Wisconsin was in play. If you look now, this is a state that is a relentless focus. We have folks on our team who've been organizing here for 3 years at the Democratic Party. Trump hired his Wisconsin state director in July 2019. There are ads every time you turn on a Packers or Badgers game, mostly Biden ads at this point. Trump keeps traveling here to try to shore up his numbers, and we're seeing a flood of early votes and absentee votes, of volunteers jumping on phone banking shifts, of chalk art on college campuses. This is a state that is in full battle mode for the ultimate battleground state status in the ultimate election, and it is intense.
Ben, talking about why this time might be different from 4 years ago, I think one of the factors last time was voter turnout. What do you know about voter turnout at this point? What are you anticipating?
So 2016, two striking things happened with turnout. The first is that Trump and Clinton both bombed. They both got fewer votes than 5 out of the previous 6 presidential nominees. They got fewer votes than the loser in 2004 and in 2012. Only John McCain did worse when he got completely routed by Obama in a 13-point landslide in 2008. So a lot of people just didn't vote for either of them. And the other part of that story is that a lot of people voted third party. There were 2 different candidates who got more than Trump's margin of victory in Wisconsin. There's no similar third party energy in Wisconsin this time. Folks who are fed up with Trump know that it is time to vote for Biden. And in 2016, a lot of people said, I can't vote for either of these candidates. That's just not happening the same way this time. Now, it's hard to model turnout in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. What we can see is that there is a rush of people casting absentee ballots and now doing early vote in person. The total number as of today is more than 1.33 million ballots cast in a state that only cast 3 million total ballots in 2016. we think we have a decisive edge among votes cast by mail that have come in so far. It is closer among people doing early vote in person. Republicans are talking about a flood of people on Election Day. There are two very different election campaigns being run with different tactics to organize people to vote in different ways. And in a sense, it's a big kind of political science experiment. In another sense, every person who votes for Biden and Harris now is someone we don't have to focus on turning out for Election Day. And I think our strategy gives Democrats an edge as we race to the finish line.
When those of us who are not in Wisconsin hear about Wisconsin, we're told there's a big difference between the cities and the suburbs on the one hand and the rural districts on the other. They vote in very different ways. Is that true? And how is that breaking down this time?
So the magic recipe in Wisconsin for Trump, if he wants to win, he needs to stem his losses in the suburbs, especially the suburbs around Milwaukee. He is clearly trying to suppress the vote in cities like Milwaukee, as I'm sure he'd be happy to suppress the vote in Madison too, and he needs to rack up massive margins in rural areas. And for us, the recipe is the opposite. We're working to help every possible voter cast a ballot in our cities. We're working to organize folks in rural areas to hold down Trump's margins. And frankly, I think we're gaining ground in rural areas rather than losing it. And in the Milwaukee suburbs and suburbs across our state, there's a huge swing that we can see happening in real time. Trump would have to win a commanding share of the votes in places like Waukesha and Ozaukee County and Washington County, the so-called WOW counties. Instead, we're seeing, state assembly candidates who are on the march in these districts that were gerrymandered to be permanently Republican in those suburban areas. So, we're organizing for every square inch and for every voter in our state. And Trump is losing ground in all three areas, it's like a balloon. If it can't squeeze bigger somewhere, then the whole thing is going to pop. It feels like that's happening with Trump's numbers right now.
Ben, we've been talking about really the horse race aspect of it, which is terribly important as we're 8 days away from the election. But talk about the issues. What is motivating voters, in your judgment, in Wisconsin right now? What's driving them?
Wisconsin has one of the worst, arguably the worst coronavirus outbreak in the United States. If you look at new cases per capita, we are worse than 46 other states across the country. Only Montana and the Dakotas have a more rapidly rising case count than we do. We have hospitals filling up, spilling into field hospitals. This is something that's transforming people's lives, and it's crushing the economy, it's crushing small businesses, and it's forcing schools to make these impossible decisions in a way that squeezes working parents. So this is the inescapable reality in Wisconsin. Trump was already underperforming. He was breaking his promises about manufacturing jobs and farms before the pandemic hit. This has made that situation far worse. And in the middle of it all, people are terrified about losing protections for pre-existing conditions. So healthcare and the virus interact in this pretty intense way, and it's turning people against Trump. If you think coronavirus is a hoax, you're probably casting a ballot for Donald Trump. If you're worried about your family and your friends and what's happening to your business because of this pandemic, you're going to vote for Joe Biden. And more people are seeing that and are worried about it. When Trump comes here and holds super spreader events, it kind of reinforces that he doesn't fundamentally care. When his White House says that they can't get the virus under control, it underscores that this president's given up on the thing that is just taking a toll on every person's personal life. It's what affects people, as Kellyanne Conway said, not what offends people. And people are affected.
Right. Ben, thank you so much. That's really set the table for Wisconsin so terribly well. It's Ben Wikler. He's Wisconsin Democratic Party chairman. He's going to be staying with us for the second hour of Balance of Power when we're going to talk about the voting process in Wisconsin this year and how they're going to count all those absentee ballots. And a programming note now, Bloomberg will have live coverage of the election results starting at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday, November 3rd. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Turkey is in the news today as the lira falls below 8 to the dollar in the midst of geopolitical tensions, including with France. And France has recalled its ambassador now. And President Erdogan has now asked his citizens to stop buying French goods. To take us through where things stand, we welcome now Bloomberg's Istanbul bureau chief. He is Onur Ant. So, Onur, thank you so much for joining us. Where are things right now? Is he serious? Turks are just not going to buy anything from France?
Well, it's difficult to gauge and predict the success of these calls, David. People usually tend to forget about them after a certain period of time, and it's the first time Turkey really did, Erdogan did try to call for a national boycott in a couple of years since the diplomatic spat with the U.S. back in 2018. So I guess we're not going to see people seriously sort of backing away from normal consumer behavior for a long time. But it's still, nonetheless, it's quite important what happened today because it shows how low the Turkish-French relationship has really sunk. And it wasn't really good to begin with, but it really got a lot worse.
And it strikes me, Owner, that it's not just these two countries and various issues they have, but there's a sectarian element to this because, as I understand it, it was triggered, the recall of the ambassador was triggered by President Erdogan questioning the mental ability of President Macron. And that's because President Macron had some things to say about that tragic beheading of a French teacher.
I think it goes. It will predate the gruesome murder of the French teacher earlier in October when President Macron first talked about his vision to quote unquote reform Islam, which he said was a religion crisis. I think it really didn't go down well in Turkey, to say the least, with the political leaders, and especially Erdogan seems to have taken a serious issue with it. So the tension has been rising since then, but I think it burst to a level where it completely grabbed headlines over this weekend because of Erdogan's first remarks about President Macron himself, and then ensuing decision by Elysee to recall this ambassador from Ankara over this fact.
Owner, does the offense taken about the remarks by Mr. Macron about Islam, does it go beyond Turkey? Is it affecting other Islamic countries over in the region?
We are seeing signs of that. There have been calls for boycott of French goods in parts of the Arab world, just to the south of Turkey, in places like Kuwait and Qatar. But I think there has been a somewhat rough and broad division among countries in the region. Countries like Iran and Turkey, which sort of both champion political Islam, although in very different manifestations of the word, and their somewhat ally Qatar is on the one side and very vocal about criticism of French policies or French policies vis-a-vis the Islamic community there. And then on the other side you have the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, and you don't really see much of a backlash there.
Yeah, it's fascinating, really important story. Thank you so much to Owner Ant. He is Bloomberg's Istanbul bureau chief, joining us today. Coming up next, we're going to have former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick about the election. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio.
This is Balance of Power. I'm Guy Johnson. Stocks finishing up the day here in Europe. Remember, this week, 4 hours between New York and London, hence I'm appearing in Balance of Power. Stock 600 gapping lower first thing this morning, but finishing near session lows. Bunch of factors coming together today. Some macro factors. We're seeing a huge pickup in COVID cases here in Europe. Plus, the data's not particularly good. We had a very poor IFO survey a little bit earlier on out of Germany. Plus, we've also got some granular stock stories, which are also pushing markets around quite a lot today. So a kind of macro top-down, bottom-up kind of story really hitting Europe in a pincer movement today. It's real dispersion between the individual markets as well. FTSE 100 only down by 1.2%. But take a look at what is happening with the DAX over in Germany, down by 3.65%. This is where the individual stock story is really coming into play. The CAC 40 down by 1.9%. The individual stock story for the German market today is SAP, absolutely being demolished in terms of its share price performance, as you can see, down by 22.32%. The earnings story out today, and particularly the outlook today from this Waldorf-based company, really very poor. And you wonder whether or not there's going to be significant read across into others within the space as well. US tech, certainly watching what is happening very carefully here. So SAP down hard. Just in terms of context, this is the biggest move in SAP to the downside since 1999, just before, obviously, the dot-com bubble burst. A very germane date, obviously, and a relevant date for everybody that's watching what's happening with the tech space. In terms of other individual stock stories, there are some that are definitely worth focusing on. London's outperformance coming in large because of AstraZeneca today, up by 1.85%, the biggest points gainer. The reason for this is we are seeing a very positive response to elderly patients who are in the test for the Oxford vaccine. That was taken very well by the market. That stock up by 1.85%. But travel stocks broadly on both sides of the Atlantic are under pressure. Carnival, the dual listing, down by 9.7%. And in the car sector, this is kind of why the French market kind of went in the middle between London and Frankfurt today. PSA up by 0.6%. We are seeing Peugeot merging with FCA Fiat Chrysler, and it looks like we're going to get European regulatory clearance for that story. That's the European close. David.
Thank you so much, Guy Johnson. And just to bring you up to speed on this side of the Atlantic, we continue to sell off in equities. We've got the Dow Jones leading the way down right now about 2.75%. So we'll keep watching the markets over here as well. In the meantime, let's get back to politics. Deval Patrick served 2 terms as governor of Massachusetts after his tenure as Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights in the Clinton administration. He is now co-chair of American Bridge 21st Century, and we welcome him back now to Bloomberg. Governor, it's always a pleasure to have you with us. You have a piece out of Medium in which you really take the Trump administration to task. And it's not surprising. You're a Democrat. President Trump is a Republican. But in reading this piece, it seems to go beyond just some disagreements. You think there is some fundamental damage that may have been done to the country. And I guess in reading it, my question to you is, can we turn it back around?
I think we have to. And I say that not as a Democrat who thinks you have to hate Republicans to be a good Democrat. You know, we don't always get it right. And frankly, most people aren't accepting 100% of what either party is selling. But I think that it turns out democracy depends, David, on some unwritten rules around decorum and restraint and respect, integrity. And so many of these rules have been flouted by this administration, and we simply have to see that as a threat to our democracy.
Let's talk about the thing that perhaps is most pressing to everybody right now in this country, and that is COVID-19. Because we had a terrible bout with it back in March, April, into May, and now it seems to be coming back, in some ways perhaps even worse than before. What can and should be done about that? And in fact, is Mark Meadows, the chief of staff to the president, kind of right? We really can't control it.
Well, we can control it. We could have controlled it better had we been honest with each other. And had the president been honest with the American people from the beginning. But health experts agree that wearing a mask, social distancing, rapid and widely available testing and tracing are all important, that we have to have guidelines that are followed consistently and are comprehensive across the country and not kind of state by state and region by region. This is one of the areas where the lack of leadership at the top has really, really hurt us. We've managed to politicize a public health emergency. Imagine that. It's like the last thing I would have imagined it could have been politicized, so that now wearing or not wearing a mask is deemed some, expression of freedom instead of what it is, which is a profound example of selfishness.
Governor, it's a tradition sort of in the United States, as you know, with a new president, talk about the first 100 days of the new presidency. Take us forward. If, in fact, the former vice president is elected and we have a President Biden, what would you imagine in that first 100 days with respect to COVID-19? What would be different from what we've seen in the past?
Well, again, remembering that COVID-19 and economic recovery are very much connected. They are not separate things. I think we can expect from an incoming Biden administration a comprehensive plan that talks about these public health steps that we should take, talks about what a distribution plan around a vaccine should be, and most Americans agree that healthcare workers and folks with contact with children and vulnerable populations should be first. That there will be to say it again, a plan, a step-by-step set of guidelines that we can all refer to in making our individual choices, and that those choices will be inspired by candor and clarity about what we know and what we don't know going forward.
As a practical matter, a lot of people are getting tired of the social distancing and even the wearing the mask. I mean, there's a fatigue that's setting in this country.
Right.
Would a President Biden be able to enforce those guidelines? I mean, would we have fines? Would we be arrested or detained if we didn't follow the rules?
I just don't know if we're going to need to go as far as all that. And, everybody's tired. I'm tired. I have to imagine that the former vice president is tired too. We yearn for a return to our routines and to contact with other people. But the way we beat this is by making some shorter term sacrifices that are in the common good. And I think having a president, a leader who shows that kind of leadership and reminds us how important it is at times like this to turn to each other rather than on each other is a big part of what we need, all of us, to get to the other side.
So, Governor, you obviously have successfully run for office more than once now. Give us a little insight into the strategy we're seeing right now. Which are the states that are key? And let me ask about a couple states I didn't think I'd ask about. New Hampshire and Maine. I understand now President Trump is heading up there. Does that signal something about a weakness on the Democrats' part in those states?
Well, I think it may signal something about a weakness on the president's part. You know, first of all, let me just say I don't think any vote anywhere should be taken for granted. And I think Democrats have to be about talking to everybody and making a case to everybody about what a Democratic plan would be, not a plan for Democrats, but a Democratic plan for America. And that is about growing the economy out so that everybody has an opportunity and not just up, so that the well-connected have their chances. It's about health care for everyone that is affordable for everyone, that is a combination of and a choice between public option in the ACA or private insurance, which is more effective and more equitable. It's about racial equity, and it's about engaging people and helping folks understand their own stake in their civic and political future. So I think that case has been made well by the Biden-Harris ticket and by other Democrats running for the Senate and the House. It's an exciting time, I think, because the challenges are so great, but the opportunities to try some new things, to do some things differently, is also presented. And so I think, yes, you'll see lots of folks talking about and focusing on at American Bridge, for example, where I'm involved, on Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. There are pickup opportunities in the Senate in Maine. There are opportunities in Kentucky and Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi, where I was last week. Folks, Democrats are talking about Texas as a battleground state. But the point is, everybody everywhere counts, everybody. And I hope that folks remember that when they go to vote.
I'm glad you raised American Bridge and the work you've done in some of the swing states, because you've been on to talk about that. I want to talk about two in particular. Florida, we all understand, is critically important. That President Trump has to win that if he's going to succeed as a practical matter. We see former Vice President Biden spending a fair amount of time in Florida. But what about Pennsylvania? That's the one I'm curious about, because we now have President Trump spending a lot of time in Pennsylvania and Vice President Biden not as much.
Well, I can't speak for the Biden campaign's choices on a day-to-day basis, but I know that they have spent a lot of time in Pennsylvania and spent a lot of money in Pennsylvania reaching voters, both for reasons of persuasion and also to get out the vote. Pennsylvania is a big, complex, really, really interesting state, I believe. It's one of the places where, our presumptive base in urban communities is pretty strong. And that in between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, there is a lot of room and a lot that's up for grabs. I think when you heard in the last debate, for example, Vice President Biden talking about transitioning away from a carbon-based economy to a carbon-free economy, you heard President Trump say, "See, listen to that. If you live in Pennsylvania and you're worried about the future of fracking." And I think people should pay attention to that, but not for the reasons of sort of being afraid that President Trump brings up. Governing by fear, campaigning by fear, I think is never a good idea. This is about what kinds of innovations, what is the next thing that America can lead on. And what Democrats have to be about, and what I believe Vice President Biden is about, is how to make sure that everybody has a place in that future.
Okay, Governor, it's always such a pleasure to have you with us. That's Deval Patrick. He is the former Massachusetts governor and now co-chair of American Bridge 21st Century. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. With 8 days to go until Election Day, more people already have cast ballots in this year's presidential election than voted early or absentee in the 2016 race. More than 59 million people have voted in person at early voting centers or by mail. The surge comes as voters try to avoid crowded places on November 3rd during the coronavirus pandemic. President Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor, Jared Kushner, is drawing criticism on Twitter after saying that black people must, quote, want to be successful, end quote, in order for his father-in-law's policies to help them. Kushner made the remarks on Fox and Friends today. Mr. Trump lost among black voters by about 82 percentage points in 2016, but has closed the gap in support to about 71 points this year. That's according to polling data, 538.com. Residents in El Paso, Texas are being urged to stay home for 2 weeks. Officials are trying to stem a spike in coronavirus cases that has overwhelmed local hospitals. Governor Greg Abbott has also transformed part of the city's civic center into a makeshift hospital and is sending nearly 1,000 medical personnel from across Texas to the region. Americans are rushing to pharmacies in record numbers for seasonal flu shots as the pandemic brings new urgency to this year's flu season. CVS says it has already surpassed the 9 million flu shots it gave during the entire previous season and expects to double that number by the end of the season. Walgreens has given 60% more doses in its U.S. stores than at this point last year. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Coming up, we hear from Republican Senator of South Dakota Kevin Cramer about stimulus prospects and energy policy. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. However the election comes out 8 days from now, it looks increasingly likely that any stimulus bill will have to be taken up in a lame duck session after that election. Our chief Washington correspondent talked with Republican Senator Kevin Cramer of South Dakota about the prospects, as well as about his state's concerns about energy policy.
I've always believed there would be a lame duck deal, and I think as long ago as a couple of months ago already, the window had gotten pretty tight for a pre-election deal, partly because some people were waiting to see how the rest of it still played out, partly because we were getting closer to the election and nobody wanted there to be winners, only losers. And while the White House and the U.S. House were negotiating up, the Republican Senate was hanging tight at about $500 billion. And so I never really did think we were going to get a deal before the election. I was hopeful, but you asked the magical question, that is, and how much? And I think in the lame duck, regardless of the election result. Now, the election result will no doubt inform to some degree what that number might be. But either way, I think the pressure valve gets opened and people get back to at least some semblance of normal, and it'll be a number between the $2 trillion that they're talking about now and the $500 billion that Republicans have.
What do you say to folks who say, we just can't afford to spend upwards of $2 trillion?
Yeah. I say you're right, but we also can't afford to do nothing. And while the debt and the deficit certainly are important, and obviously they're skyrocketing, but we pretty much threw those rules out the window when we passed the not just the CARES Act, but the $1 trillion worth or so before that even. So now it's a matter of how much is necessary. I think at the point of the CARES Act, we didn't know how long it would last. I don't think anybody anticipated that the downturn would last this long. There's been some nice recovery, Kevin, certainly in lots of areas. However, I maintain it's very fragile. You mentioned investors up front. I think investors are watching very carefully, and the Federal Reserve has pretty much done all it can with liquidity tools that they have. It really is upon
What
us.
Specifically are you fighting for in the next round of stimulus?
Yeah, so one of the big things I think is paycheck protection forgiveness. I think that's been clumsily handled by the SBA. I think a lot of our lenders at every level, large, small, credit unions, banks, they strongly encouraged after our encouragement to get a lot of borrowers into the PPP. A lot of people have been pleased with it. However, it was always designed to be forgiven if people used it to maintain their payrolls. People have been doing that, and now the bureaucracy kicks in. I think we have to do that. But I think we have to help the airline industry. And I know some people think, well, that's just a bunch of billionaires, rich people. You know, next to energy itself, I think the airline industry probably touches the value chain of just about everything in our economy, and they need some help until we can get, you know, demand back.
Well, let's talk about energy, because last week in Nashville at the final presidential debate, there was a key moment where Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden said that he was not against banning fracking. He was against banning fracking on federal land, and then he went on to say that he would like to have zero emissions by 2025. How do you square that circle?
Well, you can't, and that's the problem. That's why I think that his message was incoherent, and to the degree that it was what he meant to say, it was frightening. I mean, he did clean up he said complete zero emissions by 2025, which is absolutely impossible, obviously. A net zero by 2050 is what the United Nations, the IPCC, is advocating for. So he's very confused. I think he doesn't know much about energy policy, quite honestly.
Well, what do you say to the family of refinery workers or the refinery employees? I mean, I know energy is such a crucial economic engine in your state. You defeated a Democratic incumbent in your last election. Energy played a crucial role in that specific election. I mean, what do you say to refinery workers who have been pummeled by the economic downturn this year and who are trying to understand, and they don't really, maybe they're for Trump, maybe they're against Trump, maybe they're for Biden or against Biden, but they're trying to figure out what their economic forecast is going to be for not their portfolio, but for their kitchen counter?
Well, no question. So when you talk about a desire to transition away from oil and gas, first of all, I don't even know why you would want to do that. We have an abundance of this resource in the United States. We've gone from being a net exporter from a net importer to a net exporter. That has had national security implications as well as economic implications. So I think what we have to tell them is, no, we're not going to transition away until there's some other market force that requires it. We're just going to find cleaner ways to utilize oil and gas and coal and the other baseload fuel sources that are so important in the value chain of the global economy. So everything we consume touches energy, or energy touches it. Every value chain, every supply chain of everything we grow, produce, manufacture is touched by the energy supply chain. So we have to fight not just for those workers, but for everything that they represent, and that is national security, economic security.
That was Senator Kevin Cramer, Republican of North Dakota, speaking earlier with Kevin Cirilli. More on the market sell-off ahead. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. It's time for you to check on the markets with the equities down. Scarlett Fu is here with all the details. Scarlett?
David, of course, we're looking at some disappointment over any movement on stimulus, but I really want to focus in on three companies that are leading declines here. It's yet another sign of rising tensions between Beijing and Washington. Last week, the State Department gave Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and Raytheon it's okay to sell almost $2 billion of arms sales to Taiwan. Today, Beijing responded with sanctions on the three companies. No word on the amount or timing, but keep in mind that this weapons package is not a done deal. Congress still has to sign off on it and do a final review. What it includes are missiles from Boeing, a rocket system from Lockheed Martin, and aircraft surveillance sensors from Raytheon. Beijing also upset over Lockheed Martin's sale of some F-16 jets to Taiwan back in August. And the backdrop here is, as you know, Beijing considers Taiwan a part of China under its One China policy and has threatened to bring the island back to its fold by force if necessary. Taiwan, for its part, counts on the United States to keep peace in the region and also to sell it its arms so it can defend itself militarily. Sanctions clearly not good for business overall. Lockheed Martin says its presence in China is actually limited. Asia as a whole makes up about 10% of revenue. Boeing is in a bit of a trickier spot because it sells a lot of commercial planes to China, including the troubled 737 MAX jet, which is still grounded. So for now, defense sales count a lot more. Meantime, if you look at what's going on in China, the leaders there are gathering this week to map out their 5-year plan. It's going to be a 4-day closed-door meeting, and whatever comes out of it, the National People's Congress will be rubber stamping in March. What investors will be looking for is some indication of a continued shift of the economy to be driven by domestic demand, domestic consumption, rather than exports. And of course, that's part of the dual circulation because it does count on additional external trade to supplement growth.
Okay, thank you so much to Scarlett Fu. Coming up, second hour of Balance of Power on radio. Thanks so much for joining us. This is Bloomberg.